Hello, I'm Mark Christ. I'm the head of adult programming for the Central Arkansas Library System, and I'm also a Civil War historian, and I'm doing a series of videos on the Civil War in Arkansas for CALS. So black soldiers had fought and died in the country's earliest wars, but in 1820, the U.S. War Department issued an order that no Negro or mulatto would be received as a recruit of the Army. That order remained in place for more than 40 years, but with the advent of the Civil War, some called for an immediate recruitment of black regiments. Among the loudest and most persistent of these advocates was Frederick Douglass, a former slave who now published Douglass Monthly and acted as a spokesman for free blacks throughout the North. In October 1861, he editorialized, "Let the slaves and free colored people be called into service and formed into a liberating army, to march into the South and raise the banner of emancipation among the slaves." It would be many months, however, before any action would be taken. President Abraham Lincoln had many issues to contend with, including keeping the border states of Delaware, Maryland, Missouri, and Kentucky from going with the South, and thus providing easy inroads into Union territory. "I hope God is on our side," he reportedly said, "but I must have Kentucky." Interestingly, some of the first initiatives toward arming blacks occurred on the Confederate side. In Louisiana, free men of color formed companies and offered their services to the governor. Indeed, some of these men were in Confederate service when Union troops captured New Orleans in April 1862. A recruiting office was established in Memphis in April 1861 to recruit free blacks in West Tennessee, quote, "for our common defense." In Arkansas, a Helena planter offered to raise a regiment of black troops. W.S. Turner wrote on July 17, 1861 that all we ask is arms, clothing, and provisions, and usual pay for officers, and not 1 cent for the Negroes. Our Negroes are too good to fight Lincoln hirelings, but as they pretend to love Negroes so much, we want to show them how much the true Southern cotton patch Negro loves them in return. The Confederate War Department replied 2 weeks later, saying that this department is not prepared to accept a Negro regiment tendered by you, and yet it is not doubted that almost every slave would cheerfully aid his master in the work of hurling back the fanatical invader. But now there is a superabundance of our own color tendering their services to the government. Southern states did, however, impress large numbers of slaves to perform manual labor, such as building fortifications, which led the U.S. Congress to authorize confiscation of any property, including slaves, that was being used to benefit the Confederate war effort. For President Lincoln, the goal of the war was preservation of the Union, and this was reflected in the actions of many of his generals. Escaped slaves were routinely returned to their masters in border states. Hearing rumors of a slave uprising in Maryland, this man here, Brigadier General Ben Butler, offered his Massachusetts soldiers to that state's governor to use in quashing any insurrection. In Missouri, Pennsylvania, and West Virginia, Union commanders reassured slave owners and put their men under strict orders to crush any signs of servile rebellion. George Brinton McClellan, commanding an expedition in West Virginia, told his regimental commanders to see that all rights and property of the people are respected and repress all attempted insurrection. As historian Dudley Taylor Cornish understated, here was no John Brown. Butler soon changed his tune, however, and coined a phrase that defined the status of escaped slaves. On May 24, 1861, he refused to return the three runaway slaves of a Confederate colonel, reasoning that they were being used for military purposes and could thus be confiscated as, quote, contraband of war. 3 months later, Congress passed the first Confiscation Act, which allowed the seizure of slaves, quote, employed in or on forts or any military or naval service of the Confederacy. As runaways soon flocked toward Union armies, increased numbers of white Southerners were forced to perform the tasks formerly undertaken by slaves. Other generals, however, took a different approach. Missouri Commander John Charles Fremont, following the disastrous Union loss at Wilson's Creek, issued a proclamation on August 30, 1861, in which he seized the property and freed the slaves of all Confederate sympathizers in the state. Lincoln, mindful of the delicate situation in the border states, quickly revoked that order, and Fremont was soon removed from command. On April 13, 1862, David Hunter, commander of the Department of the South, issued an edict that all persons of color lately held to involuntary service by enemies of the United States in Forts Pulaski and on Cockspur Island, Georgia, are hereby confiscated and declared free, and shall there hereafter enjoy the fruits of their own labor. Several weeks later, he extended his proclamation and went well beyond the spirit of the first Confiscation Act by declaring that slavery and martial law in a free country are altogether incompatible. The persons in these 3 states, Georgia, Florida, and South Carolina, heretofore held as slaves, are therefore declared forever free. Lincoln, aghast after learning of Hunter's action by reading about them in the newspaper, quickly declared that the supposed proclamation is altogether void. A few months later, a Union general in Arkansas would emulate the actions of Fremont and Hunter. Major General Samuel Ryan Curtis, a West Point graduate and former Iowa congressman, soundly defeated a Confederate army at Pea Ridge in early March, then embarked on a remarkable cross-country campaign that by June found his army on the White River in eastern Arkansas. The army was mobbed by slaves who, one Yankee soldier noted, seemed to understand the matter very clearly and are on the alert to make escape by any opportunity. Ignoring the fact that he did not have the authority to do so, Curtis immediately began emancipating the runaways. His soldiers even seized printing presses to print emancipation forms. One Iowa artilleryman explained that Curtis employed the slaves to remove the logs and brush and clear the road, for which services he gave them and their families free papers as contraband of war, the first slaves set free by the rebellion. When the hard-marching Federals arrived in Helena in mid-July, they were followed by more than 3,000 freed slaves, many of whom would later be recruited into the Union Army. As Curtis and his army were establishing a base and contraband camps in Helena, this is a photo of one such camp, Congress took 2 actions that would have a profound effect on the Union war effort. On July 17, 1862, Congress passed the Second Confiscation Act, allowing the seizure of all Confederate property, regardless of whether it was being used in the rebel war effort. The act also contained a provision allowing President Lincoln, quote, to employ as many persons of African descent as he may deem necessary and proper for suppression of this rebellion. Congress also approved the Militia Act, which repealed a 1792 law barring blacks from serving in the Army and made it possible for African Americans to enlist. At about the same time, Abraham Lincoln made a decision that would change the nature of the American Civil War. On July 13, 1862, he informed members of his cabinet that he intended to issue an Emancipation Proclamation, holding that it was, quote, a military necessity, absolutely essential to the preservation of the Union. We must free the slaves or be ourselves subdued. The slaves are undeniably an element of strength to those who had their service, and we must decide whether that element should be with us or against us. The president planned to announce his proclamation on the heels of a Union victory on the battlefield, and would have to wait 2 long months until the horrific Battle of Antietam repulsed Robert E. Lee's invasion of Maryland. A few days later, Lincoln announced that as of January 1, 1863, all slaves within the Confederate States of America, quote, shall be thenceforward and forever free. Now, the primarily Western men who fought for the Union Army in Arkansas were not overly supportive of Lincoln's proclamation. Hoosier John Kummer wrote that there is a great dissatisfaction here about the order of old Abe. I could endure the hardships of a soldier pretty well before the first day of January 1863, but there is such a dissatisfaction that soldiering is a drag to me. I don't know what our country is coming to. John Harrington of Kentucky wrote angrily to his sister that I enlisted to fight for the Union and the Constitution, but Lincoln puts a different construction on things and now has us Union men fighting for his abolition platform, and thus making us a horde of subjugators, house burners, Negro thieves, and devastators of private property. David Massey of the 33rd Missouri Infantry Regiment wrote to his father that this has got to be a terrible thing. Freeing the Negroes is not what I set out to do. I don't expect to fight very hard for them. A soldier in the 118th Illinois Infantry wrote that is all we are fighting for now, and as soon as I can get out, I will, and let them fight for me. But not all the Union soldiers shared this attitude. Minus Miller, a private in the 36th Iowa Infantry, wrote to his mother on January 9 that we got the news last night at 8 o'clock that all the Negroes was free, and them that was able for service was to be armed and set to guarding forts. I think now the Union is safe, and all will be over by the 4th of July. I feel like fighting now, for we have something to fight for. Prentice Barrows of the 29th Iowa wrote that I don't see we could carry out Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation without some plan being adapted to find employment for the slaves when they are liberated. And I know of no better plan or one that would suit me better than to have them help do the fighting. While Confederate leaders in Richmond expressed outrage at the Emancipation Proclamation, Jefferson Davis called it the most execrable measure in the history of guilty man, rebel troops in Arkansas saw a positive spin on it. One soldier from the 12th Texas wrote that we have some excitement relative to Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation and flying reports in camp that the Western men are all deserting his standard. We all hope that it may have the effect to produce an explosion in his own magazine. Another Texan wrote in early February that the Feds is deserting the Northern Army and coming over to be payroll. There has been 1,100 of them deserted and come over since the fight at the post. They said they set out to fight for the Union, but it has run into the Negro question, and they ain't going to have anything to do with it. They weren't going to fight to free the Negroes. Indeed, Artemus Allen of the 43rd Indiana wrote in a letter to his father that the only effect that I saw that the proclamation has done is creating dissatisfaction in the Army and discord in the North. 300 officers have resigned on that account just from this district. As the spring of 1863 moved forward, the federal government finally took action to make fighting men of the contrabands who flocked near the Union armies. The U.S. Navy had enlisted escaped slaves as sailors since 1861, and some regiments had already been raised in the West. In Kansas, the brash, fierce General James Lane had ignored the lack of official permission to do so and raised a black regiment that included many escaped Arkansas slaves among its members. The 1st Kansas Colored Infantry was organized at Fort Scott, Kansas in August of 1862 and would have the distinction of being the first black regiment to see action. An October 29, 1862 fight at Island Mound, Missouri, where the 1st was victorious and also suffered the first fatal casualties of any African-American regiment in the war. The 2nd Kansas Colored would be organized at Fort Scott and Fort Leavenworth between August 11 and October 17 of 63, and would serve most of its time in Arkansas. And we'll see both of these regiments here in a bit. To organize the thousands of contrabands in the Mississippi River Valley into soldiers, Lincoln turned to Brigadier General Lorenzo Thomas. A desk jockey who had served as Adjutant General of the Army since 1861, Thomas accepted his new duties enthusiastically, and as one historian put it, the old bureaucrat took to the stump like a born-again preacher. On April 6, 1863, Thomas arrived at Helena. The Adjutant General spoke to 7,000 Union troops there, who received him with rapturous applause. I'm here to say that I am authorized to raise as many regiments as blacks as I can, Thomas said. I am authorized to give commissions from highest to lowest, and I desire those persons who are earnest in this work to take hold of it. I desire only those whose hearts are in it, and to them alone will I give commissions. But it was Major Benjamin Prentice who stole the show, turning to the Adjutant General and saying, "Tell the President from me, I will receive them, contrabands, into the lines. I will beg them to come. I will make them come in. And if any officer in my command, high or low, neglects to receive them, I will put them outside the lines." As Midas Miller of the 36th Iowa recounted, Prentice then called for everyone in favor of arming the African Americans to remove their hats. In a second, every head that I could see, then I could see where I could see most of the crowd, was bare, Miller wrote. He then told them that if there was any opposed to it, to pull off their hats, but not a man dared to raise his hat. The next day, recruiting began, and Thomas reported, "I authorized a regiment of this morning, and at noon 3 companies of 100 each were ready for muster." The old bureaucrat had a profound effect on Union manpower in the last 2 years of the war. By the end of 1863, 20 black regiments had been raised through his efforts, including 2,348 men serving in 4 Arkansas regiments. The total number of regiments for which Thomas could take credit would rise to 50 by December 1864. In all, around 76,000 black soldiers, some 41% of the total who served in the Union Army, were enlisted through his efforts. In Arkansas, a total of 5,526 black men would serve in the Union Army, though some of them did it reluctantly. After the initial enthusiasm passed, Prentice ordered all able-bodied black men in the region to be enrolled in the Army. On April 8, Prentice issued General Orders number 25, in which all commanders in the District of Eastern Arkansas were told to send to Colonel W.F. Wood, the commander of the 1st Arkansas Regiment of African Descent, quote, all able-bodied male contrabands who are within or who may come within these lines in their respective encampments, except such as are employed and paid for by officers as private servants or in the employ of the quartermaster's department. Newly minted Second Lieutenant Minas Miller, now the 2nd Arkansas Volunteer Infantry Regiment, African descent, led patrols in search of such likely conscripts, noting that they hide from us like chickens from a hawk. We search their houses at all hours of the day and night, sometimes at midnight. Sometimes they tell us they won't go, but we generally manage to take them. Last night I had to cock my revolver on one before he would move. He moved in a hurry when he heard it snap. Maggie Snow, the daughter of an escaped slave, remembered years later that Papa said the Yankees made all the slaves fight they could run across. Some kept hid in the woods. Seems like from the way he told it about it, they wanted freedom, but they didn't want to go to war. As new regiments began drilling, Captain Thomas Stevens of Wisconsin wrote that this, I think, is as it should be. Let us use every means we possess to conquer a peace by putting down this infernal rebellion. Edward Reddington of the same regiment also saw the potential of the new soldiers, writing home that we shall have an advantage we have never had. That is the Negro soldiers. They know every inch of the country, and the knowledge will be put to account. I am more than ever satisfied that Negroes are the best by far for soldiers in this climate. For all purposes of war, one is equal to 2 white men. They perhaps may not fight as well, but the fighting is not the 100th part of a soldier's duties. It is a standing guard, the heavy fatiguing on duties and handling commissary stores, building roads, digging trenches, and piling up fortifications. As the regiments of contrabands formed, Southern outrage grew more heated. As early as the fall of 1862, following Lincoln's preliminary Emancipation proclamations, James Seddon, the Confederate Secretary of War, suggested that black soldiers captured under arms should, quote, be executed as an example to others contemplating joining the U.S. Army. Some were killed before Abraham Lincoln grimly promised to match execution with execution, and the policy was abandoned. An angry Tennessee senator roared that the time had arrived when we should declare a war of extermination upon every foe that puts his foot upon our soil. We should meet a foe of the character that menaces us under the black flag, and neither ask nor receive quarter from this day forward. This suggestion gained the force of law on May 1, 1863, when the Confederate Congress passed a law that captured white officers and black troops should be, quote, deemed as inciting servile insurrection, and shall, if captured, be put to death or otherwise punished, while captured blacks would be dealt with under the laws of the state in which they were captured, most likely to be returned to slavery. Minas Miller, the 2nd Arkansas Infantry, African descent, grimly wrote that if I ever had to meet a black flag, I would be in favor of hoisting one myself and defending it as long as possible. And if we should be fortunate enough to get them surrounded, as I have seen them, I would say, boys, don't take a prisoner. Vengeance is mine, and I will repay, saith the Lord. In the months that followed, the black flag would be raised by both sides in Arkansas. Though the black troops would spend a disproportionate amount of time doing heavy fatigue duties, they also were learning the duties of soldiers. Nancy Anderson, a young contraband, remembered years later that, quote, Papa went to the war. He would blow his bugle and give all the war signals. He got the military training. Him and his friend Charlie Grimm used to step around and show us how they had to march to orders. Prentice Barrows of the 29th Iowa wrote on April 18 that they are very busy here now organizing a Negro brigade. There are already several companies in camp drilling. They seem to be quite apt to learn the maneuvers and take a great deal of pride in it. The 2nd Arkansas saw its first combat raid on May 27, when 25 black soldiers, accompanied by detachments of the 36th Iowa Infantry and 1st Indiana Cavalry aboard the steamboat Pike, on an expedition to gather recruits. When the Pike approached island number 65 in the Mississippi River, a party of Confederate soldiers opened up on them with 2 cannon and rifle fire. General Prentice reported that the conduct of the colored soldiers was highly creditable. They fought with a hearty will and did good service. The blacks hailed with joy the appearance of the colored soldiers. 125 recruits were obtained. The regiment is filling rapidly up, and in a few days it is hoped it will be full. 2 soldiers of the 2nd Arkansas were mortally wounded in this action, and apparently they were the first African-American combat casualties suffered in Arkansas. The large-scale battle for the 2nd Arkansas was the July 4, 1863 Battle of Helena, in which 7,636 rebel soldiers assaulted the 4,129-man Union garrison, solidly entrenched in fortifications that had largely been built through the labor of black soldiers. The 2nd Arkansas held a position on the Union left, supporting a Missouri artillery battery. Newton Scott wrote that we was not in gunshot of them, but could see them fighting all the time. Their balls whistled all around us and among us. One ball wounded 2 darkies in the arm, not dangerous. The men of the 2nd Arkansas were not the only black men who would see action on this day. David Massey of the 33rd Missouri Infantry, who had written in January that the Emancipation Proclamation was a terrible thing, was stationed at Fort Curtis in the Union Center when the Confederate troops broke through and approached the town. 4 days later, he wrote to his father that, quote, "To say that a Negro won't fight, that is all a mistake, for I saw Negroes go or I would have been afraid to go. There was a Negro worker who left his spot and came up to the fort and got a gun and went over the hill where the Rebs was and took a prisoner and marched him over to the fort." Stressing that I am no abolitionist, Massey allowed that a Reb killed by a Negro is just as good as if I had killed him. The Confederate assault on Helena was repulsed with heavy losses sustained by the attackers. Perhaps the largest expedition of troops of African descent from Helena occurred on July 25, 1864, when Brigadier General Napoleon B. Buford, commander of the Federal District of Eastern Arkansas, sent out a reconnaissance in force to, quote, "ascertain the force and design of Confederate cavalrymen in the area." The patrol, led by Colonel W.S. Brooks of the 56th U.S. Colored Infantry, consisted of 280 men of the 56th, 80 from the 60th U.S. Colored Infantry, and a 2-gun section of Battery E, 2nd U.S. Colored Artillery under Captain Jonas Fred Lemke. Major Eagleton Carmichael commanded a party of about 150 troopers of the 15th Illinois Cavalry, who steamed down the Mississippi River to disembark at Old Town and work its way back up toward Brooks' command by way of Trenton. The infantry force approached Big Creek about 22 miles southwest of Helena at 3 a.m. on the 26th, waiting until daylight to send a patrol across the creek. There they were told that Archibald Dobbins' Confederate cavalrymen had left the day before. The patrol rejoined the main body of infantry as Brooks set out pickets while he considered his next move. Suddenly, an hour later, Dobbins' horsemen attacked the little force from 3 sides. A Union report of the battle said that the least estimation of the rebel force was 3-1 to the Union force, the latter under fire for the first time. The black soldiers formed into battle lines and opened fire at the task forces with the 2 artillery pieces. The Southerners returned fire, mortally wounding Brooks and Lemke almost immediately. The African American soldiers fought desperately on. We formed our lines and held our position under a severe and continuous fire from the enemy, their lines being in places not more than 50 yards from our own, Lieutenant Colonel Moses Reed reported. For 4 hours, the black troops stood their own against Dobbins' horsemen. As they were about to be overwhelmed, the proverbial cavalry arrived. The horsemen of the 15th Illinois had heard the firing from Big Creek as they hunted rebel stragglers near Trenton. They circled around to the rear of the embattled Yankees and charged through part of Dobbins' force that was closing in behind the black soldiers. The combined Union force then began a fighting withdrawal toward Helena, fighting off attacks from all sides. The rebel cavalry, quote, "on 3 occasions by flank movement made a stand before the Union force, but were charged and dispersed in every instance." As the Yankees reached the junction of the Spring Creek Road, about 11 miles from Helena, they faced a solid line of rebels, even as other Southern horsemen pressed them from behind. We immediately engaged them in front, driving them handsomely for 2 miles when they did not again molest us, Reed reported. The black regiments and their Illinois comrades lost 19 killed, 40 wounded, and 4 missing, in addition to losing significant arms and supplies. Dobbins' losses were not reported, though Union reports list 7 Confederates killed and 5 captured. The Union commander at Helena reported that several wounded black Yankees were murdered after the battle. African American soldiers were among the men who marched south with Major General Frederick Steele's Union Army in March 1864, part of a joint operation with troops under Nathaniel Banks in Louisiana. A detail of 100 men of the 4th Arkansas Infantry, African descent, accompanied Steele's chief engineer, who reported that Spades, shovels, picks, and axes were distributed among them. They were usefully employed on the march in repairing the road, helping the bridge train through bad places, and useful as pontooniers whenever the bridge was laid. Not all the black soldiers in the expedition were engineers, however. Included in John M. Thayer's Frontier Division out of Fort Smith were the tough, battle-tested 1st and 2nd Kansas Colored Infantry Regiments, as Jim Lane had recruited from escaped slaves from Arkansas, Missouri, and the Indian Territory. These regiments would be involved, one as victim and one as perpetrator, in two of the most infamous racial atrocities to occur in Arkansas. First of these happened on April 18, 1864. Steele's drive toward Louisiana had been blunted by Confederate resistance and the lack of provender a week earlier, and his hungry army was now hunkered down in Camden. On April 17, he sent a forage train to seize 500 bushels of corn stored 16 miles west of Camden. Among the escort for the 198 wagon train were 428 men and officers from the 1st Kansas Colored Infantry. After seizing half the corn, Confederate troops managed to burn half. The party headed back toward Camden, with empty wagons branching out to seize additional food. The Yankees also stole anything else they caught their fancy and piled it into the wagons. As a Federal escort increased to 1,169 men with the arrival of a relief column marched toward Camden, they encountered Confederate pickets at Poison Spring. As the Yankee soldiers halted, Brigadier General John Sappington Marmaduke rushed 3,621 rebel cavalry and artillerymen to confront the Union troops with an L-shaped ambush. The 1st Kansas took position at the front of the train and fought off 2 attacks. Bloodied and low on ammunition, the black soldiers were overwhelmed by a 3rd well-coordinated assault. The entire Federal force soon collapsed and fled toward Camden, and the nightmare began for the survivors of the 1st Kansas. Arkansan Alfred Hearn wrote to his wife in Arkadelphia that, "I think there were 10 Negroes killed to 1 white fed. They made the Negroes go up front, and if the Negro was wounded, our men would shoot him dead as they were passed, and what Negroes that were captured have, from the best information I can obtain, since been shot. I've seen enough myself to know it is correct. Our men is determined to not take Negro prisoners." The Federal force at Poison Springs suffered 117 killed and 65 wounded, amounting to a 42% loss for the regiment. Confederate losses were 13 dead, 81 wounded, and 1 missing. A week after the disaster at Poison Spring came the loss of another 240 wagons and nearly 1,500 men at Marks Mills, a battle after which many freedom seekers were reportedly butchered. Steele decided he had had enough. The Yankees calmly abandoned Camden on the night of April 26, stealing a march on the Confederates, and made tracks for Little Rock. The rebels nipped at his heels, skirmishing heavily at several sites. But Lieutenant General Edmund Kirby Smith's main infantry column caught up with them at the crossing of the Saline River at Jenkins Ferry. Steele's infantry fought a desperate rearguard action as the rest of the army crossed the swollen river on a pontoon bridge. The terrain of the sodden battlefield caused the Confederates to funnel their infantry into disjointed attacks that the well-placed Yankees fought off while inflicting heavy casualties. During the attack, a section of Captain Samuel T. Ruffner's Missouri artillery placed 2 cannon across from the 2nd Kansas Colored Infantry. The black soldiers and white soldiers of the 29th Iowa Infantry promptly charged and overran the artillerists, with the men of the 2nd Kansas shouting, "Poison Springs!" And the men of the 2nd Kansas soon sought revenge for Poison Spring. 3 Missourians were bayoneted as they tried to surrender, and the Kansans were preparing to do the same to 6 captured rebels when several Iowa soldiers came to their aid. "The Negroes want to kill every wounded Reb they come to, and will do it if we do not watch them," Milton Chambers of the 29th Iowa reported. In a grisly reprise of Poison Spring in reverse, black soldiers prowled the battlefield, seeking wounded Confederates. A Texas private reported that after Kirby Smith's army fell back, "I looked around and saw some black Negroes cutting our wounded boys' throats, and I thought my time would come next." Though he managed to escape, many others did not. A soldier of the 33rd Arkansas Infantry wrote that, "We found many of our wounded had been mutilated in many ways, some with ears cut off, throats cut, knives stabbed, etc. My brother was shot through the body, had his throat cut through the windpipe, and lived several days." Retaliation would soon follow as wounded soldiers of the 2nd Kansas were murdered in Confederate hospitals in the weeks that followed. While the black soldiers in Africa, the African American soldiers of Arkansas did see scattered battle, the overwhelming amount of their time was spent standing guard or doing fatigue duty at garrisons of Helena, Little Rock, DeVal's Bluff, Pine Bluff, or Fort Smith. Minus Miller, following the transfer of the 2nd Arkansas to Little Rock, wrote in December 1863 that our darkies are kept very busy every day unloading cars and loading wagons and working on the railroad. They have not drilled a day since I have been here. As with other troops in garrison duty, the black soldiers suffered from the myriad camp diseases that plagued Civil War armies and caused far more casualties than did combat. As Captain James Bowler of the 112th United States Colored Troops observed in August 1864, there has been much sickness in the state during the past summer. Little Rock is the healthiest part of the state. Pine Bluff and DeVal's Bluff the most unhealthy. Smallpox, ague, fevers, diarrhea, and scurvy have been prevailing diseases. Almost every person one meets seemed to be debilitated from one cause or another. The colored troops faced the additional burden of segregated and substandard hospital facilities. Historian Joseph T. Glothar documented several cases in Arkansas. At Fort Smith, at the hospital for the black soldiers, there was evidence of habitual neglect of proper police regulations. The kitchens, outbuildings, and grounds were filthy in the extreme, and the medical officer in charge did not manifest much efficiency in the discharge of his duties. While in Pine Bluff, the Negro hospital was filthy in the extreme. The worst, however, was in Helena, which an inspector described as the dirtiest place inside and the filthiest place outside, and has fallen to my lot to inspect. The sick men are dirty in their beds, filthy and uncomfortable. Not a thing about the whole establishment could I find to mention in favorable terms. In Arkansas as elsewhere, Union soldiers, black and white, were exultant at the surrender of Robert E. Lee's Army of Northern Virginia in 1865. A surgeon of the 56th Colored Infantry wrote that we were rejoicing over the prospects of peace, all wishing to go home with as little delay as possible, all hearts beating in unison with the huge guns mounted on the ramparts of Fort Curtis as they boomed again and again with the glad tidings. However, he continued, the rejoicing soon turned to sorrow as the next mail brought news of the murder of President Lincoln. The men of the 56th Colored Infantry were furious, he wrote. The soldiers were almost frantic with rage, and at once a huge party left camp to avenge the fall of their liberator and bring some of the rebel sympathizers in this town to grief. But by doubling the guards and patrols and cautioning the obnoxious citizens not to appear on the streets, the general commanding managed to prevent the effusion of blood. The men of the 56th went back to their duties, as would their comrades in other African-American regiments in the state. Many would serve as occupation troops in the months following the collapse of the Confederate armies in the Western and Trans-Mississippi theaters, and the last would be mustered out by the fall of 1866. So what were the results of this revolution? The spring of millions and arming of tens of thousands. By the end of the Civil War, African-American troops would comprise between 9 and 10% of the Union Army, providing 145 infantry regiments, 7 cavalry regiments, 12 heavy and 1 light artillery battery, and 1 regiment of engineers. A total of 178,985 enlisted men and 7,122 officers served in black regiments during the war. Some 37,300, nearly 21% of the men involved, did not survive the war, some dying in combat, far more falling to disease. Even with the disproportionate amount of time doing fatigue and guard duty, black soldiers fought in 449 engagements, including 39 major battles. 17 black soldiers and 4 sailors would win the nation's highest award for valor, the Medal of Honor. But by taking over fatigue and guard duties, to which the Union armies dedicated almost a third of their troops, the men of the United States Colored Troops made it possible for tens of thousands of federal combat troops to battle their Confederate foes. Lincoln was not inaccurate in terming the newly available black soldiers as, quote, the great available and yet unavailed of force for the restoration of the Union. Despite such issues as unequal pay and substandard hospitals, there were opportunities available to the men of the USCT units that would not have been conceivable during slavery. Foremost among these, perhaps, was the chance to receive what would be for many their first formal schooling. Asa Randall, the chaplain of the 54th U.S. Colored Troops, championed the cause, writing that it is not only necessary for the elevation and protection of the colored people, but it is also necessary for the peace and future prosperity of the country. Randall noted that those who attend regularly when off from duty are making good proficiency in the branches taught: reading, writing, spelling, geography, mental and written arithmetic. Many who did not attend the school are taking lessons in their quarters or of those of their comrades who are more proficient. In addition, Army chaplains strengthened the bonds of the soldiers and their families by giving official sanction to common law marriages, many of which dated to slavery. More important to the former slaves who served in the United States colored troops was their freedom and the establishment of civil rights through the 13th Amendment to the Constitution, which abolished slavery, the 14th Amendment, which guaranteed their rights as citizens, and the 15th, which granted them the right to vote. Heady achievement indeed for men who a few short years before had been considered little more than property. There are also more practical considerations for the veteran soldiers. Veteran James Spikes of Pine Bluff, interviewed at age 91, noted that the government gives me a pension now because I was a soldier. It comes in right nice. It does it that. Aged and blind Uncle Willie Baltimore, also of Pine Bluff, reflected that it was a lucky day when the Yankees got me. Some of my white friends dug up my records with the Yankees and got me a pension. Now I'm sitting pretty for the rest of my life. But the greatest contribution of the United States colored troops was expressed by Amelia Thomas of Little Rock in the 1930s, who spoke about her father, George Grant. Amelia said he was on the Union side. He was fighting for our freedom. He wasn't no Reb. He tells us many a day, I am part of the cause that you are free. That concludes the program. If you have any questions, feel free to shoot me an email at mchrist@cals.org. Have a nice day.